Okay, let's talk about your homework a little bit. So the first part, it asks you to draw a four-member food chain with the organisms in the table to the right. Now, to me, the best way to do that would be to take one of the plants, either the rose plant or the wheat, and then from there, the worm is going to eat the rotting leaves. Or then the shrew, then the bird will eat the worm, and then the cat will eat the bird. So that's a nice four-member food chain. It goes straight up from producer to high-level consumer. And of course, we know the energy is going to be transferred at each of those places where one organism eats the other. Okay, number two, you probably had to do in a different space. This space right here was not very big, but it says use all the organisms to draw a food web. Label the producer and the levels of consumers. So I didn't do this out, but the producers here are going to be the rose plant and the wheat. Those are the only producers. They do photosynthesis. First level consumers are going to be like the worm and the mouse and the let's see, well, the robin will be in one case because it does eat the seeds, but in another case it'll be a second level consumer after it eats the worms. So on the test, you will have to be able to look at a food web and tell what's a producer, what is a first level consumer or a second level consumer, and is there any organisms that could be both. Okay, number three says to use the organisms in your food web to fill in the energy pyramid. So you should have the producers here on the bottom. They have the most amount of energy, then the second level, the third level, and then the fourth level. As we said, the bottom level, the producers have the most energy available. And where do the organisms in the bottom layer of the pyramid get their energy? Straight from the sun. They do photosynthesis, they take that energy in, they incorporate it inside their bodies, but they don't have to eat anything. They're producers. Okay, which organism in the food web is decomposer? That would be the worm, because it eats rotting leaves and breaks them down. It eats stuff that's kind of already dead. Why are decomposers important? Well, if you think about it, if there weren't any decomposers, if you just fell over dead, or you had a cow that fell over dead or something like that, nothing would ever happen to it. It'd just sit there. So number one, we'd have dead bodies piling up all over the place. Number two, when an organism dies, and not just cows and things like that, trees and grass and all that kind of stuff, when an organism dies, their nutrients get recycled back into the soil to be used by other organisms. So life would not last very long without those decomposers to bring stuff back to the soil. Now, worms are important decomposers, but by far the most important decomposers are bacteria. Bacteria are the things that really break things down to a cellular level. Okay, number 7 here says, which organism in the food web to the left is sometimes a first level consumer and sometimes a second level consumer? Well, if we look at that, the mouse sometimes is a first level consumer because it can eat the grass. But mice also eat grasshoppers, so in that case it would be a second level consumer. So depending on what it eats, it will get its food from different sources. Okay, number 8 says choose one food chain in the web, name all the organisms in that chain, start with the producer and end with the top level consumer. So an easy one would be alfalfa, grasshopper, coyote, or you could go alfalfa, grasshopper, mouse, coyote, or any other combination where you end up with either coyote or hawk. Those are the top level consumers in any of the food chains that are showed here. Okay, number 9, draw an energy pyramid. So for one of those, you should show the producers on the bottom, the top level consumers on the bottom, the top level consumers on the top. Then it says, what happens to the amount of energy as it moves up each level of the pyramid? Be specific. Remember, as it goes up each level of the pyramid, 90% of that energy is lost. Only 10% is passed on. on average. It's not going to be exactly that. Some organisms are going to be more efficient than others. But overall, you lose about 90% of that energy. And of course, that energy is radiated out as heat. It goes out eventually through the atmosphere and out to outer space. Okay, so that's probably, well, that's pretty much all there is for the homework. So you can go ahead and put that away. And so you can go ahead and put that. So you can go ahead and put that away, and we'll get started with the notes for today. All right, this is a diagram of one of the most important molecules to living organisms. Its name, adenosine triphosphate. Otherwise known as ATP. So today we need to learn a little bit about what ATP is, how it stores energy, and why it's so important. So ATP is a nucleic acid. Because it's a nucleic acid, we know there are three parts to it. There's the nitrogenous base, there's the sugar, and then there's the phosphate. In fact, adenosine triphosphate is very closely related to DNA in its structure. The big difference is in DNA, there's only one phosphate group. In adenosine triphosphate, there's three. Oh, it's like it's right in the name. The thing is, if we look at these phosphate groups, we see on the oxygens we've got some negative charges. If you remember from your other science classes, negative charges are like magnets. When you put them together, they're going to repel if you put magnets in the right direction. If you have a positive and negative charge, then they'll attract. But since we have negative charges here, these things are repelling. Now there is a bond that connects all of them together right here. And that's a strong bond. It'll keep it together. But because those negative charges are repelling, this is very unstable. You can kind of think of it like a mouse trap that's been set. When you put that little bar across there, it'll hold that spring back, and the bar that's going to, kill the mouse or whatever, but it's fairly unstable, and the slightest movement will set that thing off. Well, that's what's happening here. This is all held together through those atomic bonds, but the slightest little thing will set that off. And when it comes off, that is where energy is released. Okay, this diagram here kind of shows the state between that third phosphate being on and off. So when it's off, it's at a low energy state. And this is adenosine diphosphate then, or ADP. And it's kind of uncharged. We can charge that molecule by putting in energy. Just like it takes energy to take a mousetrap and pull it back and then hook it, it takes energy to cram that other phosphate on the end to make the ATP. So certain processes in the cell are going to be able to take that phosphate and cram it on. It takes energy to do that, but then that means that energy is stored here. So right here, we have a storage of energy . And then later, that ATP can interact with something, that phosphate group can come off, and we can have a release. Just like by setting off the mousetrap, then that energy is then transferred usually to the spine of a poor defenseless mouse. So even though when we look at molecules, they can seem kind of complex, this is a fairly simple process. It's a fairly simple storage system. Cram this thing on, energy is stored, interact with it in a way that it'll pop off, energy is released, and it can be used to do whatever in the cell. Now, how are we actually going to put on and take off that phosphate group? Well, we've already learned about that. So here's ATP right here. So this is in the charged state on the left. So here's the 1, 2, 3rd phosphate group. If we add a water molecule, that phosphate group will break off, and we end up with the hydrogen from one water molecule on that 2nd phosphate group, and then the OH group from the water molecule will be on that free phosphate group. So to release energy, we basically just have to do hydrolysis. Remember, hydrolysis means splitting with water. So by adding a water molecule, we split those things apart. So if a cell needs to use up some energy or needs an energy source, an ATP molecule, we take a water molecule, we split the ATP molecule, and during that, energy is released. When we want to charge up that molecule and put it back into its ATP state, then we just have to remove a water molecule. And if you remember, we call that condensation. So condensation reactions will take an ADP, uncharged, and a phosphate group, cram them together, a water molecule comes out. If we want to split them apart, we add a water molecule, we do hydrolysis, they come apart, and energy is released. Now, ATP is used in so many different systems that kind of overall we've agreed in diagrams, we're going to use this symbol, this little starburst symbol, to show that this ATP is charged and it's ready to go. So if you see that in any of the diagrams that we look at, that's just where ATP is ready to give up its energy and be used.